Hey everyone, welcome back to my studio here in Arizona. Today I've got a lot going on in my studio, but I do want to take some time to walk you through a new video about this painting here. This painting is called Morning Chromatic, and it's a painting of two beautiful horses in the eastern plains of Oregon, just as the sun was coming up in the morning. You get these beautiful colors kind of coming through both horses. This is the finish right now, but what I'm going to do in this particular video is walk you through the finish process. Now it's going to be compressed time. The full video was going to be about 2 hours, so I compressed it down to about 15 minutes or so. But you'll get to see kind of the process that I go through when I put the finishing touches on a painting like this. This particular piece actually started off as a demo painting at the Newby Gallery in Tubac, Arizona. And a lot of times when somebody like me does a demo painting, it kind of doesn't necessarily turn out to be the best painting that you've ever done. For some, it does all the time. For me, it's a little bit dicey. This one, I chose a really good painting. And during that demo, I got about 3/4 of the way done with the piece. I had a really strong sense of color all through here, a lot of reds, a lot of pinks up here in the background, and of course the greens here. It was very powerful, but it wasn't quite finished yet, which you'll see in the very beginning of this video. So in this video here, I'm not going to go through the entire painting process, but just what I do to put the finishing touches on it. So I hope you stay tuned and join me for the finish of Morning Chromatic. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started on the head part. It doesn't really matter where you start at this point, but I just wanted to start off with the forehead and the mane and the area around the eyes. My goal here really is to couple things. First of all, to pump up the contrast a little bit. So I'm going to bring in some additional darks. I felt like the darks weren't quite punchy enough. They weren't dark enough. So I'm coming in and darkening them up. I'm also bringing in some grays into the muzzle area, those wonderful Gamblin grays that I talked about in my video where I introduced the colors that I use. So some of those Gamblin grays I brought into the muzzle area. Now I'm painting very dry, almost a dry brush technique, but I do have a little bit of Galkyd Gel. Again, that's a Gamblin product. You can use a lot of different mediums. I just happen to like the Galkyd Gel because it holds up really well with brush strokes, but it also brings a level of transparency that I wanted, at least in this painting, to those upper layers. So you'll see me going back and forth, kind of darkening up some areas, and I'm also bringing in grays again around the muzzle. The other thing I'm going to be doing here, and you'll see as I move off to the body, especially a little bit later, right now you can see that the body of that first horse in the foreground is pretty flat looking. There's not a lot of contour or sculpture to it, and that's what I'm working on here. I'm bringing in some more darks. As you see in the shoulder, I'm trying to kind of again show some sculpture, show some three-dimensionality to that horse, define the muscles, define the bone structure, and kind of take away some of the flatness that is there from the initial layers of painting. And that's okay if you have that flatness coming through on your initial layer of painting, especially in oils, because you can come back over the top and, you know, add more paint. That's what I'm doing here. So the darks that I'm using are a combination of like a dark magenta, a blue, and I think I used cobalt blue for this one, with a little bit of raw umber to kind of tone it down. And then I mix in a little bit of that Galkyd Gel. Again, you can use any one of a number of different gel mediums to bring in a little bit of luminosity and transparency to that upper layer. Now here, again, I'm bringing in a little bit of gray actually in the shoulder area, but then I'm also bringing in some of those darks to sculpt the muscles, and to define the bone structure here, and just to give it that horse a little bit more interest. Now I'm going to work back. I go back and forth, to different parts of the painting. So I'm popping back over here to the head and doing a little bit more definition there. As you can see, I'm cutting back a little bit of that real bright red underlayer. I end up leaving some of it in the belly of that first horse, but a lot of it gets covered up. But when you're using a gel medium or some kind of a medium that will give you a little bit of transparency, that initial layer of bright color will shine through and kind of give the painting a little bit of glow. Now here I'm sculpting, kind of like with paint, I'm sculpting the area around the eyes, again bringing in some grays, and this particular horse had some grays around her eyes, but also in the muzzle. That's, I think, Gamblin warm gray mixed with burnt umber and a couple of other pigments, just to make it a little bit more warm, but also to help it blend into the painting. Now what's hard to tell here in this quicker movie is that there are times when I will blend the paint that I just laid down. I'll blend it with a clean brush. So I'll take a clean, dry brush and just blend the edges of the paint that I've just laid down. You can see me doing it here, where I'm coming in with a clean, dry brush and just kind of messing up the edges of the paint that I laid down so it's not so harsh. One of the things that's super important when you paint, and most early career painters don't really get this, they don't understand it, they may not have even been taught, the variety of edges is really important in order for the viewer's eye to really be interested in the painting. So I take great pains to change up how I treat the edges. And in a future video, I'll talk about edges and how you can use them, to up the interest level in your painting. But just know that I am coming through, messing up edges where I need to, making things varied, so it's not quite so boring across the painting. Now I'm continuing here to sculpt in the eye and face area, the head area, just a little bit at a time. Just bringing in a little bit more darks. What you can't see here is that in between, sometimes when I disappear, I'm actually stepping very far back away from the painting, 10 to 12, sometimes 15 feet, so that I can look at the painting from a distance and evaluate what it needs, what needs to be changed and what needs to be added to. Now here I'm going in and I'm adding some darker, almost like a turquoise blue, into the mane and the white areas on the shoulder of that horse. Again, just to give it some sculpture, some variety. I end up taking away a little bit of that blue, you'll see in just a minute, but it was important for me to lay it in so that that whole area of white there on the shoulder wasn't just a big flat area of white. I'm very cautious about that because I'm not a total realist painter, but I do like to have the horse look somewhat real. And one big just flat sheet of white there for that, that painted area, just doesn't look good to me. So I wanted to vary it up a little bit with a little bit of blue. Now, one thing that I noticed later when I let this layer dry is that blue that I put in the mane, you'll see that there's kind of a straight line of blue, like a light turquoise blue there. It was so close in color and tone to the background mountains that it really ended up confusing the viewer's eye. So later on in this process, you'll see me change that and cut that back. But for now, I left it to dry. So this is coming in actually at a slightly later date. And now I'm going to be working on the sky just a little bit. I want to bring a little bit more variety into the sky. So I'm adding some oranges. You'll see I'm going to darken up the pinks just a little in a few areas. But again, I'm also taking a dry brush and blending that paint. Now you can see I just gave a test streak of pink. That was way too pink. I cut it back, and then I'm going to use that pink to kind of add a little bit more depth to that morning sky that you see in the background. So I'm working here on a very dry paint surface, which means that I can mess up and wipe it off. So I often will let layers of paint completely dry before coming in again and bringing in new colors over the top. It also prevents the paint from mixing too much from layer to layer, and it keeps each paint layer crisp and clean. Now here I'm adding a little bit of lighter orange and yellow to that skyline area, just again to bring some variety to that background. I'm always looking to really interest the viewer's eye. I don't want the viewer to become bored necessarily. And here I knew that pink in the background needed to be broken up a little bit. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm adding some very light pink orange kind of color. So that would be white mixed with cadmium orange and just a tiny little bit of cad red, or you could use a permanent red medium as well. So I'm just working back and forth, trying to get that background to be interesting but not overly distracting. So this is coming back yet another day, and you can see now I'm going to work on that mane that ended up just being a little bit too similar to the background color. So you're going to see me come in over the top of that with a much lighter tone so that it differentiates it from that blue of the mountains in the background. And it makes it look a little bit more real too, to break that up just a little bit. Now I'm not going here for hyperrealism. That's not my goal. I used to paint photorealistically. That's how I used to paint. And that was a long time ago. But I found that it was actually super boring for me to look at and to paint. What I like to do really is I'm really interested in the paint application and the brushwork. So I'm super cautious, but at the same time I love to play with the different types of brush strokes, thicknesses of paint, and again the variety of edges. And my aim really is to capture more of the personality of my subject and more of its life energy. You know, I don't want something that looks sort of dead on canvas. I want to make my paintings look energetic. So that's why I've developed the style that I have. And we can talk about style in a future episode. This is just what I've ended up, choosing for myself over the years. And it always evolves. I keep changing and experimenting with new things. That's a real part of being an artist, is continual experimentation. One of the things that I know some of my artist friends who tend to get really well known for one subject matter, the galleries that represent them will often ask them not really to paint anything else. So here are these poor artists who are sort of stuck painting one thing over and over and over again, and they're not really given a lot of free rein to experiment. And I love to experiment. I love to play around, try new things. Most of the time, you all out there will never see my experiments because they end up either scraped off the canvas or in the trash. But experimentation is a huge part of developing your own style. And again, we'll talk about that in a future episode here. So at this point, I'm just going back in and I'm starting to add the finishing touches to the ears. And then again, I'm working back with the mane of that first horse. Now, this is an area that I noticed later that needed a little bit more work is the eye of that background horse. So this is what I'm working on right now is the eye, the jawline, and you'll see me kind of work on the muzzle just a little bit. That horse isn't very visible, but it's still, in my opinion, kind of important to the composition. So I wanted to make sure that the anatomy was correct. Again, I'm going back in and still punching up those shadows just a little bit more because I thought they needed a little bit more power to them and a little bit more sculpture. There was one anatomical mistake that I made down in the leg area that I fixed kind of in this process here. That rear leg of the horse in front was just a little bit too narrow, so I widened it up just a little bit. So here I'm going into the shoulder and sculpting the shoulder just a little bit more. We're almost done at this point. Just adding the finishing touches. And the big deal is that, you know, it's hard to know when to stop sometimes. So at this point, I start stepping back from the painting a lot. And I'll evaluate it. I may even evaluate it for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. And then come back to it and continue on. I'm not in a rush to get something finished. I want it to be done correctly. That's my whole aim with this. Now, at this point, I'm just adding little tiny touches, just a couple things here and there, but it's essentially finished at this point. All right, so here's the finish of Morning Chromatic. Thanks for watching, and I hope you come back soon.